Great, I might just start with the introduction just as people are still coming in. Welcome everybody to this webinar, Accreditation in 2030. And this will form part of the fellowship, the ISQua fellowship programme. A lot of the content of the fellowship programme has recently been updated, and the new content will be available in a few short weeks, hopefully 2 weeks, on the new ISQua website and learning management system. So anybody who's already registered for the fellowship programme or is a member will receive correspondence about our new website soon. So just before we get started, I'll just give a quick introduction. I'm sure neither of our two speakers today need an introduction. Just to note as well that unfortunately Jackie Stewart is unable to make this, but she has still contributed to the presentation and to the slides. But today we have Wendy and Carsten. So I'm sure most of you know who both of them are, but Wendy Nicklin is a recognised healthcare leader across Canada and internationally. Obtaining her academic degrees at McGill University, Wendy has extensive experience as a critical care nurse and in progressive leadership positions. She has participated in many provincial and national initiatives, such as the National Steering Committee for Patient Safety, and as a founding board member on the Canadian Patient Safety Institute board for 8 years, working to contribute to its establishment and success. And also Wendy, importantly, is ISQUA's immediate past president. So, and then also our new CEO, Carsten Engel. So Carsten has been involved in accreditation with ISQUA for many years. And after a clinical career in Denmark, Sweden and Norway, in 2006, Carsten joined ICAS, the Danish Institute for Quality and Accreditation in Healthcare, and was appointed Deputy CEO in 2010. Carsten was a leading member of the team that developed and implemented the Danish Healthcare Quality Programme. Joining ISQUA as CEO in 2021, Carsten has been a member of ISQUA's EEA since 2010, so before that it was called the Accreditation Council, since 2010. And has been deputy chair for the period of 2016 to 2021. He's recognised as an ISQua expert since 2013 and was appointed a member of the International Academy of Quality and Safety in 2019. He has contributed to the development of ISQUA's international accreditation programme and has been an ISQua EEA surveyor since 2010. His passion for quality and safety in healthcare internationally is very well known. So we're delighted that Carsten has joined ISQua, and Wendy and Carsten are going to take you through this presentation today. And again, as I say, Jackie was unable to make it, but she did still contribute to the presentation. So I hope that you enjoy it. And during a couple of places during this presentation, we're going to have some questions for you. And we'll invite you to answer those either in the chat, or you can use this Q&A box, which is down the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions in there as well. Okay, I'll hand it over to you guys. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Okay, thank you very much, Katrina. It's our pleasure to be with you today, and my pleasure to actually open this webinar following Katrina, titled Accreditation in 2030. With my colleague, Dr. Carsten Engel, and as Katrina mentioned, Carsten is the new CEO of ISQua, and we're delighted to have him at the helm. Again, as Katrina mentioned, regretfully, Jackie Stewart is unable to be with us. Jackie is the CEO of COSASA, which is the accreditation body in South Africa, in Cape Town, South Africa, and was instrumental in both writing the article I will reference, as well as helping us put this presentation together. This webinar is based on our article recently published in the International Journal for Quality in Healthcare in December of 2020. Now, why did we write an article that underpins this webinar? Why did we decide to try to predict health services accreditation to the year 2030? First of all, the three of us are all experts, experienced colleagues in the field of health service accreditation. Discussions about enabling the ongoing relevance of accreditation is a topic shared amongst our colleagues regularly. Secondly, ISQua itself is a leader in accreditation. ISQua, as you know, has an accreditation program and we also accredit accreditors. We accredit standards, surveyor training programs, and accreditation organizations. ISQua has a vested interest in the quality and relevance of accreditation. Thirdly, as members of the International Academy of Quality and Safety, Carsten and I and Jackie were challenged to envision accreditation in 2030 and write an article in this regard. We welcome the opportunity to share our thoughts with you now, and more importantly, to receive your questions and reflections about this topic. The webinar is set up such that your input as listeners will be sought once during the presentation and at the conclusion, and Katrina has given you some instructions as to how to do that with us. The webinar will initially focus on the principles underlying accreditation, followed by the trends that are leading to changes in accreditation, changes in the content and the model. Then we will look into the crystal ball at accreditation into 2030. The contribution of ISQua in this regard is highlighted at the conclusion. So regarding the objectives, and you can read these yourself on that slide, but briefly, we're going to overview the historical pattern of accreditation or external evaluation, as accreditation and external evaluation in some ways are interchangeable. The principles are accreditation. We're going to look at the pressures on accreditation and the challenges impacting both the accrediting organization and the accreditation program. We will look at the changing perspectives on the role and focus. You'll be challenged to think about the evolution to date and the steps that have already been taken to maintain relevance and value. We hope you will gain insight into the potential model of accreditation in the year 2030. And we will looking at learning the role and contribution of ISQua. How will ISQua adapt in moving into 2030 as well? And then integrating the elements presented within this webinar to enhance your knowledge and understanding about accreditation and ensuring its relevance and value in 2030. I'll turn it over to Carsten.
Thank you, Wendy. This slide is to show you that accreditation has a long history and can actually be traced back even longer than the timeline at the bottom of this slide. It can be traced back to 1919. It began in North America in a joint program of the US and Canada. And of interest, it was actually started by a surgeon. The first to follow Canada and the US was Australia. As you see, from the mid-90s and onward, it evolved from something specific to only a few, mainly Anglo-Saxon countries, to a worldwide movement. While accreditation was initially focused on hospitals, it has now evolved to be applied and valued in long-term, in aged care, in community health, rehabilitation, palliative care, and also in ambulance services and community pharmacies. ISQua became involved in accreditation in 1999, initiated by leaders of accreditation organizations from all continents. This led to the formation of the International Accreditation Program within ISQua, what Wendy referred to as accrediting the accreditors, and as Wendy told you, there are 3 sets of standards and principles for standards, organizations, and surveyor training programs. This slide shows you how the number of accreditation organizations in the world was increasing rapidly from 1995 and onwards. And as of 2009, accreditation could be found in 38 countries with a total of 44 programs. The International Accreditation Program happens still to be present in 38 countries now, spread over all continents, although not exactly the same ones. You can see the countries where there are currently accreditations program here. And the reach is even broader than this list suggests, since accreditation is an international activity. Typically, an accreditation program has its origin and operates in one country. Some provide international services in addition, and a few have been established specifically for international accreditation. So accreditation can be found in more countries than those on the list that, as I said, represents the location of accreditation bodies in the IAP membership. In some countries, there's more than one accreditation organization, and there are organizations that are offering accreditation but are not members of the IAP. If you compare the two lists, you will find that some countries have dropped out, others have opted in. The number of accreditation organizations has not continued to grow as rapidly as in the zeros, but another trend has become apparent. Whereas accreditation originated as hospital accreditation and for many years was confined to hospital, it is now offered to all types of healthcare. Name any type of healthcare provider, and I would be almost sure that you would be able to find somewhere an accreditation program for this type of provider. This means that the number of programs or standards offered by one accreditation organization tends to increase. And if we count at the types of services accreditation are offered for in terms of accreditation programs, this will sum up to 318 programs. 318 programs. So, accreditation is thriving. Why then does it need to change? Well, this guy, take a look at this guy. He is effective, thriving, he rules the world. Why should he be concerned about the future? Well, something happened. I don't believe that we are close to this scenario in accreditation, but we know that the world is changing. We will dig deeper into this in a moment. Here, I'll just mention as one example that our ideas about the patient's role are not the same as they were 30 years ago. And of course, we all know that we are here and now in the midst of a crisis from which a new normal is expected to emerge. Accreditation programs historically have adapted incrementally the content of the standards, methodology, etc. But is this enough? Things change all the time, so must accreditation, and maybe it's time now to step back to challenge and review some of our basic assumptions. For certain, this is not the time to reassure ourselves that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It may be broke before we know of it. I have already alerted you to the fact that the world is changing, but in addition, there is what I would call the plateau or ceiling effect. In some countries, accreditation has been carried out for 10, 20, 30 years or even more. The ISQua principles for accreditation standards that sets the overarching framework for accreditation standards are currently in the 5th edition, revised, but the bulk of the basic ideas remain the same. Should we believe that doing the same again and again will continue to have the same effect that it no doubt had the first and second time? Add to this the difficulties in establishing a solid evidence base, as demonstrated in a recent systematic review by Araujo et al. That was published in the International Journal for Quality in Healthcare 2020. But a side remark on that, referring to the issue of evidence, are we asking the right question if we stick to a paradigm for generating evidence where we see accreditation as a well-defined intervention applied to a number of similar systems in similar contexts, in systems that respond in a linear way? There are critical voices. There are different types of critics. Some are perhaps not so serious. They can block implementation, but the concept as such is not under threat from the wrongedor type that basically says, don't interfere with my autonomy, and occasionally finds the lack of randomized control, trial-based definitive proof or effect a convenient lever to pull when trying to combat accreditation. I think the critique by Doggett and colleagues, as outlined on this slide, is different. It's basically fair, and it is given from a friendly position from someone who wants accreditation to succeed, and therefore it should be taken seriously. And it's an interesting report that I would encourage you to read. We who work closely with accreditation know a lot about both strengths and weaknesses. No need to wait for outsiders. One Danish university took as its motto, as its motto, in tranquillo mors, in fluctu vita, in the calm is death, in the flow is life, and there is a truth in that. So our challenge as those that deliver accreditation and those that utilize accreditation is the question, how does accreditation reframe and reposition itself to ensure relevance in 2030? Over to Wendy.
Thank you, Carsten. So on this particular section of our presentation, we're going to speak about the trends. The world is changing, accreditation cannot remain static, and what are the trends that you and I are experiencing around the world right now? A few highlights from this particular slide about the trends. Notice that the genomics revolution presumably leads toward individualized medicine, which means one of the foundations of traditional evidence-based medicine is now challenged. Also, in times of crisis, we have experienced that things that no one had considered possible suddenly are. Inertia of habits is weakened. Telemedicine as an example. Another is preparedness to abandon a habitual silo orientation. Pardon me. The COVID pandemic has been and continues to be a major catalyst of change. I think we're leapfrogging forward in many areas that if this had not happened up now, probably wouldn't happen for decades or much more slowly. And then there's the impact of a chronic crisis, which in some ways is what we are moving into. How do we manage transitioning from an acute crisis to a chronic state? Elements of accreditation speak to this. It is the mindset that accreditation enables. And there's a metaphor, to handle a crisis, you need to have a well-equipped toolbox, but you can't prepare a manual that you just have to follow. And I think, again, our response to the pandemic is witness to that. And our perspective is changing. And I think you are sensing this in whatever aspect of healthcare within which you are involved. I think you're feeling this perspective that's changing. We're going from a focus on the provider to the focus on the patient and their family, which is where it should be. And previously, as indicated here, typically quality was about a delivery of health service that met the expectations that were set by the provider, by the professionals. Now we're recognizing that the patient and families are integral to that and involved and a key partner and really the center of everything that we are doing. So we're emphasizing here the active involvement of patients in the accreditation process as well. So while involved within your health service program, active involvement of patients or clients within the accreditation process is important. Further, the COVID pandemic has placed increased attention on mental health of healthcare providers, increased attention further on aged care and long-term care homes. So again, we're seeing this shift. There is one important change away from vulgar standardization. We have to accept that patient values and priorities may differ from ours, and from the values and priorities we think they ought to have. So this is an adjustment to everyone as we move forward. Now, the next slide here presents a few questions that we are posing to you now. And we'd like you to think about those. And if you could enter your responses or thoughts, reflections in either the chat or Q&A, and then we'll have Katrina moderate this. So the questions, as you can see, are how are accreditation programs with which you are familiar responding to the forces? What do you think are the greatest challenges? How does accreditation maintain relevance and value? In your experience in your country, are the accreditation programs adapting and reflecting the new realities?
Next, we will try to clarify our concepts. What is it that we're talking about? And this is reason for this headline. Let us take a look at what accreditation is and what it is not, some principles. And we have listed a number of key words here. First, the word tool. Accreditation should be seen as a quality improvement tool interwoven with other quality improvement strategies to achieve maximum value. It's an enabler. It equips an organization to manage and improve quality and patient safety. It's a component of a complex set of strategies. It does not stand alone. There are many other factors that contribute to setting the stage and enabling. Accreditation is part of this, not an add-on. It's very important that accreditation is not seen as a task added to other tasks of the organization to achieve an award. It's an integral part of your strategy. And if it is viewed and acted upon as this, it is also a driver of improvement. It does so by stimulating reflection, by guiding action, and it must be admitted also sometimes by setting a deadline, also, although advanced organizations have moved beyond this and don't see accreditation as a deadline they prepare for, but as a part of their daily operations. It has a quality of life focus and is thus, and by the other things I mentioned, a catalysator of culture change. It contributes to improving patient satisfaction and engagement and can be used to give patients a voice if we involve them in standard setting, involve them in generating the information on which we base our accreditation outcome. It integrates important concepts such as person-centered care and drives change in the system. And what I think is a very important insight, it is a vehicle for knowledge transfer and translation. It can translate knowledge to action and then to outcome if we write standards the right way and if we approach the implementation of standards and the dialogue at survey in the right manner. One core message is that it is not a standardized off-the-shelf intervention. We are traditionally, accreditation has traditionally worked by influencing outcome, by controlling processes. In the future, we will emphasize influence with a culture as well, but how do we fit compliance-oriented standards in to fit for this purpose? Again, not a standardized off-the-shelf intervention. One caveat, we should remember that accreditation is not an absolute guarantee of quality and that accountability and responsibility remains with the provider. It's not with the accreditation body. So, how can we position and benefit from accreditation in this new world? And just to mention two extremes to you that we are not really likely to encounter in real life, but they still are the sort of, Scylla and Charybdis, the two risks and evils with which we have to navigate. And the one point of this extreme of the scale, we say, join accreditation X and your healthcare system will become great. We know what's good for you and it's all in our standards ready to do. We want to give more room for adaptation, but we will also not be, at the other extreme, the caricatured couch tip. Well, what do you think? People come to us because they want some advice, some stimulus, not just to get the questions turned back on themselves. Accreditation cannot give a recipe to follow, but it can provide a structure with sufficient room to adapt and flex to be relevant to the organization and the system. After stating these principles, we would like to take you fast forward to accreditation in 2030, the new reality. We have realized the idea of customized accreditation, no more one size fits all. Healthcare organizations that participate in accreditation look for a program that's relevant to them, and therefore we must customize and deliver customizable programs. Quality may ultimately be a global concept, but the current status, the current context, the current gaps and culture is variable. Therefore, one size does not fit all. But it lies in this also that we must be very clear about what is it for a problem we wish to solve by employing accreditation. It's not just the diffuse idea of this will improve things. We must be more precise. Assessment will be from the service user's perspective, patients, family members, other consumers of health services. And as we said before, we must turn from viewing quality as job done according to professional standards to patient has achieved desired outcome in the preferred way. That doesn't mean that jobs should not be done according to professional standards, just as this is not the ultimate outcome. This is a means, not an end. Accreditation will not be a process conducted as one point in time and then repeated 3-4 years later. It will be an ongoing process. The tools and the content of the program will be useful as in an ongoing way by the organization staff. There will be an emphasis of outcomes, health and organizations performance outcomes. Structures and process are important and relevant, but they leave us not the ultimate aim. Methodology shifts, and it's evident that methodology must shift to reflect all of these points above. Our overall goal is that of increasing value add, but at the same time decreasing the work of accreditation and enhancing its relevance, which means that as we put things into the bucket, we must also find things to take out to retain a reasonable workload. The pandemic has showed us that moving accreditation to a purely virtual program is probably not realistic. People miss the interaction you can have at a physical on-site survey. For a short period of time, it will have to be conducted virtually, but returning to in-person accreditation surveys is essential. But we will be likely to develop hybrid model, and one consideration is that the virtual world would allow us to connect on an ongoing basis between on-site visits. We may also consider how accreditation can help a system to find its way towards the desired outcome rather than giving them a manual, but it's a balance. Systems also want help and advice. In the paper in the International Journal of Quality in Healthcare that Wendy referred to, we present this table that kind of summarizes a move from accreditation 1.0 in 2020 to accreditation 2.0 in 2030. Instead of listing criteria for a well-performing organization in a way trying to emulate one success in another setting, which has its limitations because contexts vary, etc., we would see standard as set an agenda to achieve a defined aim. Instead of, or perhaps better in addition to, because this is not a shift from 1.0 from 2.0 to 2.0, it's a question of balancing the elements of 1.0 and the elements of 2.0 and employ each of them where they are the ones that are most likely to achieve what we want to achieve. So in addition to specific requirements for structures and processes, we would also have guidance for structures and processes, but also for guidance on how to lead a complex system. In another word, maybe how to infuse resilience into systems. Traditionally, processes have been examined for compliance with requirements, but they should also be examined to understand why outcomes are as they are. This means that surveys from being examinatory also becomes exploratory. We judge less on process compliance, more on outcomes and reports on mechanisms. We advise you but instead of telling you what you should do, we help you achieve what you want to achieve. And in addition to the assessment based on classical survey methodology, we will find ways to make more data sources contribute to assessment. Actually, nowadays there's a very rich body of data in any healthcare organizations, and this should be levered as part of the accreditation process. Wendy? You're muted.
Apologies, yes. I see there's some rich comments that are coming into the chat box. So we will get to those. We'll conclude our next few slides, and then we'll be pleased to reflect on some of those comments. So now I'm going to switch and talk a bit about ISQua. And we mentioned at the beginning of our presentation that ISQua itself has a external evaluation program, but actually formed the ISQua External Evaluation Association. So the accreditation work of ISQua is now situated within the ISQua External Evaluation Association. So still much an important component of ISQua, but we've actually structured a bit differently in order to deliver the program. So the ISQua External Evaluation Association provides the International Accreditation Program. And the IAP, as we call it, will continue to adapt and reflect changes. It will also enable the needed change within the accreditation programs and the accreditation organizations. ISQua will continue to be a convener of researchers and play an increasingly valuable role in this regard, where gaps in research are identified, where researchers can share and challenge each other as to research within accreditation and related areas and facilitate evaluation and sharing of experiences. The ISQua role in supporting networks, conferences, and regional meetings will continue to be vital. And I think we all look forward to the day when we're actually physically back together in some of those meetings, in that it is through these interactions that we all further learn, contribute to strategy, and ensure effective response and adaptation to the pressures. And no question that over the past year, we've adapted to using Zoom and other means to facilitate the networking. And ISQua has worked very diligently to continue with that role in the virtual world, and it has gone reasonably well. So finally, in conclusion, and looking back from 2030 to today, what have we seen? As noted here and looking back, what has clearly evolved and strengthened has been the input of service users and key stakeholders. So currently, yes, we seek the input of service users and key stakeholders. However, Carsten and Jackie and I suggest that by 2030, that will catapult forward even more with much, much more effective integration and stakeholder involvement. Today in 2021, we seek the input, but it is just the tip of the iceberg. Effectively obtaining and using input and participation of key stakeholders must take that giant leap forward. With accreditation adapting as it will for 2030, its relevance is strengthened and will continue to strengthen. Right now, perhaps you or your colleagues periodically said, what is the value of this? Is it just too much work? What is the value? And with the changes moving forward, the value of accreditation and its relevance will strengthen. We will finally, by 2030, have measures to assess the impact of accreditation on the culture of health and social care organizations. Finally, we say COVID has forced our hand and demonstrated that you can do a hybrid accreditation survey. And we are learning with that. There are certain things the hybrid approach enables. There are certain things that we need to switch more to virtual. Other components, no question, the actual physical visit on site to meet the people, to feel and sense the culture is very important. And it is a never-ending journey, a journey of quality improvement of accreditation organizations and programs. And as Carsten said earlier, accreditation is a quality improvement strategy and needs to be integrated within your organization's total quality improvement program. It's not just an add-on program to be done in a cyclic basis, but it needs to be integrated within your quality improvement strategies. And now it's time where we look forward to some dialogue from you and hear your opinions and comments. And so we're posing more questions here, but we're not going to lose what you've identified in the chat or Q&A as well. So what we've identified here, as you think about the evolution of accreditation programs over the past 9 years, so we want you to project to 2030 and look back to today. What have Carsten and I omitted? Are there some gaps that we're not commenting on? Are there any trends or changes that we have missed? Is there an obvious area omitted? From your vantage point, will the model of accreditation in 2030 as presented be of greater relevance, or what else must shift? And finally, as a health and social care leader, whether frontline, senior management, government, or elsewhere, what do you see as the greatest leadership challenge going forward?
Sorry, just after that, then we will go to these questions. If you want me to go through them, Wendy.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So Peggy had asked, do you have any advice about how to overcome negative accreditation attitudes? Many people have an initial fear or trepidation about the external review process, and this seems to me to be a fairly consistent barrier.
Yes, I think we have all heard that. Carsten, do you want to take a stab at that, or I'll back you up?
Okay, now, obviously it is important where the standards come from. If the professional bodies in some way has been engaged as stakeholders in the process of developing the standards, so that you can say these requirements are requirements that we all agree are reasonable, this is what we should meet, then you are a lot better situated than if it's something that's coming in from the outside somewhere. But I also think that for an organization to benefit from accreditation, the top management must go in for it, and they must send the message that this is what we're doing, explain what it is that we are doing, and then listening to the voices from the floor and letting them have a decisive influence on what do we actually do to meet these requirements. And the worst things that can happen if we produce standards that are seen as a lot of red tape addressing things that are considered more or less irrelevant by the staff. So it's very much a question about involvement and communication.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I totally agree. I think the attitude of management is critical here. You know, how does management view the accreditation itself? Do they see it as a quality improvement, as a means to enable the organization to improve? Or is it, you get it right or it's wrong, and then there's a stick attached if people don't comply? It's really important that that quality improvement philosophy is understood and that it really filters through the entire organization as to what the value is and what the purpose of it is. But I think it's often those beliefs of management which really permeate the organization and affect the attitudes of everyone. Another point is that using the tools of accreditation, using the standards and any other tools that may come with the program in more of an ongoing basis can help shift attitudes a bit as well. If a team uses the standards perhaps annually just to reassess the effectiveness of their program, or if you're in critical care or palliative care, whatever, if you plan on a regular basis, perhaps annually, to review the standards, and just say, let's reflect on what they are and see them as that improvement tool, that it's not a test in 3 or 4 years. It's something that can be utilized. And then when it's time to prepare for accreditation, frankly, you're already prepared. But I think it's very important to look at those attitudes and then identify strategies to overcome that. And having people like ourselves speak to an organization can help as well. Carsten.
And I would also say that the first experience of accreditation is very important. And this is actually one reason why I think that I can see that it is financially attractive to do virtual surveys. But there is a difference when you have an experience where real live people come to your organization, walk around, look at what you're doing, talk to random people, not just to people who are summoned to a Zoom meeting. It is, I think that would be hard to replace. Maybe once it becomes routine, things can be different. But it has been our consistent experience that people who have been skeptic and negative has almost always appreciated the dialogue they had with the peer surveyors that came to them. And that's a great asset for us to be able to use.
Absolutely.
Thank you both.
Katrina?
Yeah, there's a kind of a related point made by Joel, and he's talking about how accreditation should be a pleasant experience for participants. He says it's a very important challenge, how to reduce the administrative bureaucratic effort that comes with the pursuit of accreditation. And I guess during the presentation there, you talked about 2030. It looks like hopefully it might become a more dynamic and interesting, journey, and it'll, like you say, it'll be ongoing and not just every 3 or 4 years. I don't know if you have anything else to mention there for Joel, just about the bureaucracy involved.
No, I think the goal, reducing the bureaucracy, frankly, is critical. And I think it behooves the accreditation organizations for, the different programs that other bodies have to really, really critically look at what is done and how to streamline what is required. The other thing we envision by 2030, and as we mentioned, is that they'll be more customized. So the organization that's experienced has been through accreditation many times. The nature of the accreditation process they will go through will be refined somewhat, that everyone doesn't need to start from step A and go through to Z, that we customize and be sensitive to the accomplishments of an organization and what they have already done. And again, if the tools are used on a more regular basis, then there really isn't that bureaucratic prep in the same way there has been before. Carsten, what would you add?
Yeah, but we have seen that bureaucracy can grow, and we have heard the most incredible myth about what is required to be written down in procedures. And I think we should move away from the idea that this is about procedures. An organization obviously needs procedures, written procedures, but they need them to help people doing the right things. It's not the procedures that define and describe into the nitty-gritty details the organizations. And I would like a survey where we mostly focus on what people are actually doing and what the results are. And if we find a problem there, okay, then maybe we would scale down, dig down to see, well, can this problem be traced back to some fault in the procedures? But I would not. I would get away from the picture that first we go in detail through all your procedures, and then we check if you do as you should.
Thank you. Carlos has said, as a healthcare assessment tool, it is supposed to impact people learning, it's supposed to impact people learning, and the improvement outcomes should be reflected in the patient's experience. I think one of the challenges is to measure those two factors, learning and the outcomes on people's experiences. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think different programs, different accrediting bodies are finding mechanisms to do that. Some are incorporating a patient engagement survey, an assessment such that it's conducted in the organization and that data or the results are made available. And I think we encourage every organization in healthcare to be assessing patient experience and satisfaction. It's very important to be doing that regularly, and feeding that information then into the accreditation assessment is very important. And then the issue is, what did the organization do with it? So here are the results. So what? What did they do with it? So that information, it behooves the organization to have steps to do that. And there may be some assessments that are done in particular program areas, such as within an emergency department or within a clinic setting. There may be some that are organization-wide and fairly broad, but the organizations need to define that, and as I say, bring that forward to the accreditation process. And there's also surveys that look at culture and assessments that look at culture, and how does that affect strategy and what you do with that. And these should be considered then by accreditation. Carsten, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I mean, leadership management today is very much about using data. And one of my favorite quotations from a paper by Meredith and Woods and others and colleagues is the difference between using data and information in general in a problem sensing way or in a comfort seeking way. We should use it in a problem sensing way. And that's one of the things we should assess. And then we come to the customization side. In some countries, there are well-established systems for measuring patient experience, for instance. We shouldn't try to reinvent that in that case. In other countries, it's not the case. And here the accreditation body can play a role in being the driver for establishing such measurements.
Good point.
Thank you. Another comment here: transparency and access to standards is something we should be talking about as we move forward. I find it odd that so many standards are not publicly available. Obviously, this links to the question of financing.
That's a very good point. I mean, my bias, you'll get my personal opinion here, is the standards should be available. I mean, how can people learn and grow and benefit from the standards if the standards are not readily available and transparent? You know, and they, with the internet, et cetera, there is not added cost in that way. And I think it's very important that they're transparent.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But apart from commercial reasons, it can also be maybe a reminiscence of a time where accreditation was something that was done for the benefit of the management, shared with the management, and kept confident. Times are changing.
Yeah. Janice also agrees with that comment about the standards being transparent, and says that in the digital age, we are all living in both personally and professionally. The use of data in relation to the standards should be used to drive learning and improvement. We have then Carlos. From my view, at this stage of the pandemic, we haven't yet any clear changes on accreditation processes, but except the external assessment delivery from on-site to online. I wonder if accreditation standards is to be reviewed mainly on risk management issues or on patient safety methodologies.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I believe that accreditation standards can be used on all 6 domains of safety. And just to give you an example, when we're talking about cooperation in systems where we have many different independent providers that in common contribute to the outcome for the patients, standards can give them a language in their discussions of how to develop their services, and a language that is not associated with rules as language coming from the regulators, a language that allows them to be more creative, imaginative, and that is, in my view, is one way of realizing the learning potential, which makes standards to something that's different from regulatory standards or whatever they're called.
Mm-hmm. Peggy has said the organizational culture and climate literature is quite extensive, especially in human services. So that would be behavioural health, social work and foster care, etc. She says it will be very interesting to see how accreditation programs measure and intentionally adjust their approaches to impact cultural outcomes. This is a very exciting area for new research, in my opinion.
I think that's absolutely an excellent point. And I would suggest that right now, accreditation does impact culture. The goal is to really enable an organization to shift, to have, you know, when we have standards that reflect on quality of work life, on the safe environment, our goal is to be working with organizations as they continually strengthen their abilities in those areas, and our staff involved in decision making. You know, is attention being paid to, if there's turnover, understanding those factors and having staff engagement surveys and so on. So I think fundamentally accreditation now is impacting culture, but I think you know, Peggy's absolutely right that there's a wealth of literature there, and you know, we could well perhaps optimize that input even more as standards are updated and we continue to strengthen, no question about it.
Mm.
Yeah. And in that way, we would be more intentionally changing the culture.
Absolutely.
And if I might add another point, there's another science that I think we should be integrating into accreditation, and that's the science of resilience, resilient complex systems.
Hani in Cars in Jakarta. So he's asking if we should improve virtual accreditation surveys in the coming years, even after COVID-19. And that's because of the economic benefits, I suppose, for organizations to have a virtual survey. It's quite expensive to have the in-person, the visits, I suppose, to on-site surveys.
Yeah, I think the challenge is for accrediting bodies, including ISQua, to really evaluate what the impact has been of the shift to virtual, and with a real objective assessment, including feedback from the organization being visited virtually, to really redefine what will the new balance be. I mean, as Carsten said, to actually be on site and have surveyors there speaking with you, etc. There's a dimension there which is lost when you go virtual. At the same time, a lot can be accomplished with the virtual perspective. So we have to find that new balance with a real effective assessment. I'm also involved with medical school accreditation at this time, and we've conducted 2 medical school accreditations in Canada using virtual methodology, but we've involved academic researchers with us to really assess the impact and what's going to happen going forward, knowing we will be virtual maybe for the next year. But we've got to carefully look at what may the right balance be. No question about it. Carsten, do you have any comment in that regard? Yeah.
You have said it very well.
Carlos has, just based on one of your questions at the end there, he says that he thinks the greatest leadership challenge is to merge differences in HR inclusion trends and leaders to become more motivational influencers than ever. And we're just at the end of the hour. I'm conscious of that, but I don't want to leave anybody out. We've only got a couple more, so I might just finish them. So Ilham has said, in my healthcare organization, the work is all geared towards becoming ISO 9001 certified and not accreditation. I wanted to understand, what is the difference between being ISO certified and accredited? Will ISO certification bring us closer to being accredited?
Carsten, I'll let you take that.
Well, in my view, ISO 9000 is, at least from the outset, a generic standard for quality management systems. I would say, but I may be biased, that accreditation takes a somewhat broader perspective in going a bit closer to what's happening at the clinical cold phase, where patients and providers meet. Would that be a fair way to put it, Wendy?
Yeah, and I would add, ISO tends to be more of an audit procedure. Something's in place or it's not in place. Whereas accreditation is that quality improvement approach. And I think if someone receives ISO certification 9001, I do not believe it may contribute somewhat to their approach to quality management, but the quality improvement philosophy and approach is different. I mean, it's, I guess you could say they're complementary, but I think ISO 9001 certification wouldn't mean, necessarily mean it's easier for you to get accreditation. You know, I think it may help put some things in place, but, and I believe as well, Carsten, it's more structure and process oriented ISO.
So Joel just wants to follow up on the question there from Dr. Hani in CARS. Is there a platform for accreditation professionals to exchange their experience, struggles and hacks using software and technology for accreditation services?
Well, no. The place where accreditation professionals come together, or at least representatives from the organizations, would be the Accreditation Council of ISQua EEA.
That could be something. I mean, we have our new website coming up soon, launching soon, and there is forum areas on that, and we have a lot of accreditation organizations who are members of ISQua and will have access to that forum area. So that could be something we might be able to start up ourselves, just to be able to give people a chance to share experiences and what they've learned and what they find easier and harder when trying to conduct things, their surveys virtually. So yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, and then the very last thing, so we're 4 minutes over, sorry everybody, from Hani, he just has one more question. So a surveyor should be a fair judge to evaluate what is right or wrong, but also become a motivator and teacher to educate the hospitals to have a high spirit to change. So how much of the surveyor should be judge and how much to be a motivator, if you could separate that into like percentages or fractions?
And I would say we're not there to judge. We're there to coach, coach, provide input, reflect, encourage, motivate's a good word. I think we've moved beyond that judge terminology, and there's been an attempt by most organizations in accreditation that when you assess how standards are achieved and so on, to really, you know, take it from that constructive perspective, and to be fair in you know, what your ratings, et cetera, will be. Carsten?
Yeah, and I would actually say that it is one of the things that makes it, I would not say easy, but makes it easier for us to reach the professionals, that we come with the attitude that we provide an assessment and we motivate you, but we only provide an assessment. We do not judge. Everybody knows that if the assessment is bad, someone may act on that, but that's not on the agenda when we are there.
I should conclude, Katrina, and that's not to say you may have a situation which is a poor example. So, I mean, there may well be a survey or an approach which, you know, the person just doesn't get it. And that's very unfortunate. And that I think fundamentally, as Carsten and I are saying, you know, the goal really is to be there to, you know, be constructive and coaching and so on. But I think we've all had negative experiences that color your impression.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks, Carsten. We've no more questions. And but I would like to say thanks to all of the attendees who have contributed, because that was a good discussion there. Nearly half an hour we've been discussing that. So thank you, and thanks to both of you and to Jackie as well for putting this great presentation together in this webinar.